At the beginning of 1976, both the Sooners and the Crimson Tide looked to reload. Both teams had lost a boatload of talent. Oklahoma lost 3-year starter at quarterback Steve Davis, running back Joe Washington, receiver Tinker Owens, and several defensive players to the NFL. Alabama lost longtime starter at quarterback Richard Todd, running back Willie Shelby, and some key defensive players. But the expectation in places like Norman and Tuscaloosa is not to rebuild, but to reload. But if there was a time to beat them, the time was now. And for some, the plan was to beat them at their own game, with the Wishbone. In the mid-70s, more teams were starting to wake up to see what the Wishbone could do. In 1974, Pepper Rogers had taken his Wishbone attack to Georgia Tech from UCLA, but what proved to be nearly unstoppable in the Pac-8 didn't bring Rogers nearly as much success on the East Coast, as he would go 23, 20, and 1 from 1974 to 1977. After that, he abandoned the Wishbone, but his Yellow Jackets remained mired in mediocrity until his dismissal after the '79 season. Nebraska's coach Tom Osborne, who had taken over after Devaney's retirement following the '72 season, had yet to defeat Oklahoma's Wishbone, and while Osborne never switched to the offense, its success did inspire some changes, including running more option and recruiting more athletic quarterbacks, two things which would be a staple of Nebraska football for the next 25 years. Elsewhere in the Big Eight, KU had hired a man named Bud Moore in 1975. Bud Moore had been Bear Bryant's offensive coordinator, and of course, he brought the Wishbone to Lawrence. So that team that beat Oklahoma in 1975, giving the Sooners their only loss in 3 seasons, they ran the Wishbone, and they had the signal caller to do it. Kansas's quarterback that year was Nolan Cromwell, who would be named the Big Eight's Offensive Player of the Year in 1975. An All-American in track and field as well, Cromwell was a burner who led the Jayhawks to a 7-5 record in '75 and a top 10 ranking in '76 until he went down with a season-ending injury halfway through the season. KU would finish 6-5 that year, the first time the Jayhawks had back-to-back winning records since 1961 and '62. Following Cromwell's departure, KU would suffer through 2 losing seasons before Moore would ultimately be fired. The Big Eight's only other Wishbone team, Oklahoma, would go through some struggles of their own in 1976. Their new quarterback would be Dean Blevins, more known for his passing than his running, but a player who knew the offense. Through the first 3 games, the offense would sputter. The Sooners would lose 7 of 11 fumbles in the opener and would be outgained by Iowa State in Game 3, yet they would win all 3 games. On top of the lackluster offense, OU lost their brand-new signal caller to an illness right before the Red River Shootout. Switzer handed the reins over to Thomas Lott, an athletic quarterback who had run the Wishbone in high school. Unfortunately, his inexperience showed against Texas as the blood rivals would battle to a 6-6 tie. The next game against Kansas, however, Lott's talent came through as he rushed for over 100 yards. Lott took over the starting job from Blevins permanently, but '76 wouldn't be another championship year for the Sooners. Injuries on defense began to mount, and back-to-back losses to Oklahoma State and Colorado sent the season off the rails. In spite of ending the regular season on a 3-game winning streak, including a win over Nebraska thanks to a nifty hook and lateral, they would share the conference title with the Cowboys and Buffaloes. Colorado got the Orange Bowl bid, so the Sooners were off to the Fiesta Bowl to play Wyoming, coached by Fred Akers, a former Texas assistant who had brought the Wishbone to Laramie in 1975. His first season was less than exemplary, as Wyoming went 2-9, par for the course for the Cowboys at that time. But in 1976, Akers would lead the Cowboys to an 8-3 regular season record in their first bowl game in 10 years. As expected, the Cowboys were no match for the mighty Sooners, who defeated Akers' team 41-7. But it wouldn't be Akers' last matchup against Barry Switzer. The head coaching job had just come open at the University of Texas. Texas had come into the '76 season with high expectations, ranked number 7 in the preseason. But a season-opening loss quickly brought the Longhorns back to earth. However, the ship looked to be righting itself after wins over North Texas, Rice, and SMU, and a tie versus the third-ranked Sooners. But the wheels fell off in the second half of the season, as the Longhorns went 2-4 down the stretch, ending the season at 5-5-1, including a 27-3 loss to Emory Ballard's Aggies. At the end of the season, Wishbone legend Darrell Royal finally called it quits. Akers stepped in to fill the gap. Even though his background was Wishbone-oriented, there was something that made Akers depart from his favorite formation. Earl Campbell. Though Campbell had been successful in the Wishbone, Akers believed that if he were made the feature back, the Longhorns would not only win, but Campbell would also win the Heisman. And that's exactly what he did, rushing for over 1,700 yards and scoring 18 touchdowns while averaging 6.5 yards per carry. The Longhorns would go undefeated in the regular season, but lose to Notre Dame in the Cotton Bowl. The Longhorns averaged 37 points a game, and for Akers, that was good enough to permanently close the book on the Wishbone offense at Texas. As for Oklahoma, the only blemish on the 77 season was a loss to Texas, and they seemed to be back to the prolific offenses of the Steve Davis years. A legendary win at Ohio State early in the season set the pace for the Sooners, who would score over 35 points 6 times in 1977. Perhaps the Sooners' kicker Uwe von Schamann trolling the Buckeyes gave the Sooners the spark they needed. Going into the bowl season, OU had a shot at the national championship if Texas lost. Notre Dame granted OU's wish, but Arkansas had other plans as the Razorbacks boat raced the Sooners 31-6. Arkansas had the benefit of having faced 2 Wishbone teams in the regular season to help them prepare for the Sooners: Texas and Texas A&M. Over the past couple seasons, Ballard's Aggies had finally been rounding into form. In 1975, they had started the season 10-0, even beating Texas. Season-ending losses to Arkansas and USC, in which the Aggies only totaled 6 points, left a sour taste in Aggie fans' mouths. But it was still something to celebrate, as it was A&M's first 10-win season since 1939 when the Aggies went 11-0, and their first conference title since 1967. 1976 was another successful season for A&M, as they matched 1975's record, beating Texas and Arkansas in the regular season, and beating Florida in the Sun Bowl. In 1977, the Aggies took a step back. After starting the season 3-0 with a convincing 33-17 win over number 7 Texas Tech, the Aggies looked completely helpless in Ann Arbor, as Michigan destroyed A&M 41-3. Losses to Arkansas and Texas didn't help matters, and a loss to USC in the Bluebonnet Bowl brought the Aggies' record to a respectable yet disappointing 8-4. In 1978, expectations were high, and after some head-scratching blowout losses, Ballard's seat was getting warm. After starting 4-0, the Aggies ran into a buzzsaw in Houston as they were shut out 33-0. The legendary Bill Yeoman was still coaching for the Cougars, and his veer torched the Aggies, while A&M's Wishbone floundered. A loss the next week to Baylor led to Ballard's resignation under pressure from the alumni base, but Ballard would land on his feet. Mississippi State had been impressed with his ability to turn around the Aggies, and they hired him before the '79 season. Mississippi State wasn't the only SEC school that wanted to emulate Alabama's success with the Wishbone. In fact, they were a little late to the game. In 1974, Florida head coach Doug Dickey switched to the Wishbone. At the time, the Gators were a middling SEC team. After adopting the Wishbone, Florida did improve to some extent. Without the bone, Dickey's record at Florida was 27-28-1, but while running the Wishbone, he was 21-15-1. Any hope of long-term success for Florida's Wishbone, however, may have been ruined by the infamous 4th and Dumb against Georgia in 1976. That game was a top 10 matchup, and the winner would be in the driver's seat to win the SEC. At halftime, Florida appeared to have the game in hand, leading 27-13, but things would change quickly. Georgia scored early in the third to make it a 7-point game. On the next Florida drive, the Gators were unable to pick up a first down. Inexplicably, Dickey decided to go for it on 4th and 1 on Florida's own 29. The Gators turned the ball over on downs, and Georgia took complete control of the game, ultimately winning 41-27. Some say that the game deeply affected Doug Dickey and that he was never able to fully recover from the mistake. The Gators ended the season 8-4, while Georgia went on to win the SEC. The next year, the Gators would go 6-4-1. Dickey would abandon the bone after '77 and would coach only 2 more years before being fired. Another SEC team that wanted a taste of Wishbone success was Kentucky. Head coach Fran Kersey was struggling, coming off a dismal 75 season in which the Wildcats won only 2 games. In 1976, Kersey installed the Wishbone, and it paid immediate dividends. The Wildcats went 8-4, succumbing to Kansas's Wishbone in Week 2, but defeating ranked teams like Florida and Penn State before earning a Peach Bowl victory over North Carolina, Kentucky's first bowl appearance since 1951. 1977 was marred from the start, as Kentucky was placed on probation for recruiting violations and would not be eligible for a bowl game or for the SEC title. The Wildcats didn't care, as they went 10-1, including a 6-0 mark in SEC play, with wins over number 4 Penn State and number 16 LSU on its resume. It was the first time Kentucky had won 10 games since 1950, and the last time they would win 10 games until 2018. Surely one of the greatest seasons in Kentucky football history. Probation also restricted Kentucky's scholarship limit, meaning less talent would make its way to Lexington after 1977. In 78 and 79, Kentucky posted losing records. Kersey switched offenses but wasn't able to bring the Wildcats to prominence again before being fired after the 81 season. Just as other SEC teams were giving up on the Wishbone, Emory Ballard was bringing it to Starkville, Mississippi. However, much like at A&M, it proved to be a rough start for Ballard as his Bulldogs would go 3-8 in 79, including a loss to number 1 Alabama. The season ended with 5 straight losses. The Bulldogs didn't score more than 9 points in any game during the losing streak. But hope springs eternal, and 1980 would bring a new mindset and a new offensive wrinkle to Starkville. Emory Ballard, ever the innovator, introduced his wingbone in 1980. It was a variation of the wishbone where the offense would break the bone, as it was called, by putting one of the halfbacks in a wingback position. Breaking the bone was not new. Other teams had done it. Ballard had done it himself at Texas in the late 60s. But this version of the broken bone was unique in that it almost resembled the wing tee of decades past, as the fullback lined up almost as deep as the halfback. Mississippi State would also run the split tee. Unlike the traditional split tee, however, Ballard's tee and wingbone formations had the fullback performing the dive rather than the halfback, thus retaining the principles of the wishbone. As the season drew near, Ballard exuded confidence, even telling reporters, "We are going to have a winning football team at Mississippi State, and you can put that in your papers." As Mississippi State opened the season at 3-0, it was apparent the wingbone was a big part of the team's success. It provided more opportunities for fakes, misdirection, and razzle-dazzle while maintaining the ability to run the triple option. After starting hot, however, the Bulldogs would drop 2 of their next 3, putting them at 4-2. The season stood on a razor's edge. If Ballard's team was going to fulfill his preseason promise, the team would have to perform well against a gauntlet consisting of Miami, Auburn, Alabama, LSU, and Ole Miss. The Bulldogs would beat all of them. First was Miami. The Hurricanes had the nation's 3rd-ranked defense at the time, and Mississippi State tore it apart, scoring 34 points. Miami had been giving up only 77 rushing yards per game, but 3 Bulldogs would surpass that mark by themselves, with Donald Ray King leading the way with 107 yards. 2 games later, Mississippi State took on the top-ranked Crimson Tide. If there was anybody that could shut down the Crimson Tide's mighty wishbone, it was the architect of the wishbone himself. In a game that was dominated by defense, the Bulldogs held on for a 6-3 victory after Alabama quarterback Don Jacobs lost a fumble on the goal line. That fumble sealed what may be the greatest win in Mississippi State history, as Mississippi State became the first SEC wishbone team to beat the Tide. After beating LSU and Ole Miss, the Bulldogs were invited to the Sun Bowl to take on Nebraska. But the Cornhuskers, used to seeing Oklahoma's wishbone, handled Mississippi State's wingbone, dropping the Bulldogs to 9-3. To this day, it remains one of the best seasons in Mississippi State history, culminating in the Alabama win. In the late 70s, Alabama was on another planet. However, much like Oklahoma, there was rebuilding that had to be done in 1976. The Tide lost 3 regular season games, but capped off the season with the demolition of number 7 UCLA in the Liberty Bowl. The 77 season started off slow, as the Tide lost a close one to Nebraska and beat Vanderbilt and Georgia in unimpressive fashion. But in Week 5, the Tide would travel to LA to take on the Trojans, ranked 1st in the country. After a defensive first half, Alabama exploded in the second half with 3 touchdowns to take a 21-6 lead early in the fourth quarter. The contrasting styles of offense became apparent as the passing of USC's Rob Hurdle brought the Trojans back. With time running out in the fourth quarter, USC closed the gap to 21-20 and decided to go for 2 and the win. But the Crimson Tide stood strong, and Alabama went back home with an upset victory. Alabama would run the table from there on out, and would even demolish Ohio State in the Sugar Bowl 35-6. Nevertheless, Notre Dame leapfrogged Alabama in the polls after defeating Texas, giving the Irish the national championship. In 1978, Oklahoma and Alabama would once again contend for the national title. Alabama would beat ranked Missouri and Nebraska teams before taking an L from USC, dropping them from 1st to 7th in the AP poll. Taking over the top-ranked mantle was Oklahoma, who had started the season by scoring 35, 52, and 66 points against the first 3 teams they played. Game 4 was against 6th-ranked Texas, whose I formation no longer had Earl Campbell to carry it. Oklahoma made the Longhorns pay, beating them 31-10. Oklahoma would continue to roll behind quarterback Thomas Lott and halfbacks Billy Sims and David Overstreet. Coming into their November date against Nebraska, Oklahoma was still undefeated and ranked number 1. In the fourth quarter, with OU behind 17-14, the Sooners fumbled the kickoff. But the returner went down so fast the official didn't call it and OU retained possession. OU drove down the field, poised to score, until they became the victims of poetic justice.
He runs through a tackle. He's down to the 5-yard line. He fumbles the ball. Jim Pillard has the ball.
Sims, who was having his typical All-American caliber game, fumbled deep in Nebraska territory, giving the Huskers the ball and the victory. The loss dropped the Sooners to 4th in the AP poll, while Alabama, with a victory over number 10 LSU, rose to 2nd. Both teams closed out the regular season with wins. Alabama entered the bowl season at number 2, and Oklahoma at number 4. Fortunately for the Sooners, the Orange Bowl committee decided to invite both Nebraska and Oklahoma to the Orange Bowl for a rematch, much to Tom Osborne's chagrin.
We think that the rematch will be a very exciting game and one with a tremendous amount of appeal. Hello?
Unfortunately for Oklahoma, Alabama's opponent in the Sugar Bowl was top-ranked Penn State, meaning that the winner of that game would be the national champion. The Sooners got their revenge on the Huskers while Alabama beat Penn State for the national championship. The Sooners would finish 3rd in the AP, but their consolation prize would be Billy Sims' Heisman Trophy, Oklahoma's first Heisman Trophy since 1969. Sims had a record-breaking season, rushing for 1,900 yards and 22 touchdowns while averaging 7.4 yards per carry. All this as a junior, at a time when juniors didn't win the Heisman. In fact, Sims was only the 5th underclassman to ever win the award, and he'd be back for the '79 season. In 1979, the Tide and the Sooners started the season ranked 2nd and 3rd respectively in the AP poll. Stedman Shealy, Jeff Rutledge's replacement at quarterback, proved himself to be a capable wishbone operator, while Oklahoma didn't miss a beat with new man J.C. Watts at the helm. Unfortunately, Texas held Watts and Sims in check, handing the Sooners their first loss. Alabama, on the other hand, was showing that they were even better in '79 than they had been in '78, beating their first 5 opponents by an average of 42 points. After rising to the top spot in the AP poll, the Tide faced their first stiff test in Tennessee. The Vols took a 17-0 lead before Alabama woke up. After fumbling 6 times in the first half, the Tide put their foot on the gas, rallying for a 27-17 win. The Tide wouldn't trail again until their last regular season game at Auburn, a game they'd ultimately win 25-18. The Sooners, meanwhile, had gotten back on track, beating their next 5 opponents after Texas, setting up another classic with undefeated and 3rd-ranked Nebraska. But even the Fumblerooski wasn't enough to help the Cornhuskers overcome Billy Sims' 247 rushing yards. 5th-ranked Oklahoma would defeat number 4 Florida State in the Orange Bowl, but it wasn't enough to earn the top spot in the AP poll. The number 2 Crimson Tide had beaten the 6th-ranked Razorbacks, putting them in the top spot and earning Bear Bryant his 6th national championship. 1980 was a season of change in both Norman and Tuscaloosa, as Don Jacobs would take over the reins for the Crimson Tide, and Oklahoma would graduate its most recent Heisman winner. Oklahoma would start out the season 2-2, knocking them out of the national title picture early. The Tide would be ranked first overall until their fateful date with Ballard's Bulldogs. Another disappointing loss came 2 weeks later as the Tide were shut out 7-0 by Notre Dame. Nevertheless, both teams finished with major bowl victories and top 10 rankings. When the dust had settled at the end of 1980, many Wishbone teams had come and gone, but only two reigned supreme: Alabama and Oklahoma. From 1971 to 1980, nobody won more games than those two teams. But how long could it last? Most major programs who had tried out the Wishbone had moved on by 1980. Offenses were changing. Teams were beginning to pass the ball with more consistent success. But Oklahoma, and a couple new kids on the block, were about to show the world that the Wishbone wasn't done just yet.